story of this siege does not begin with swords drawn or catapults firing. It begins with the slow tightening of a noose. Imagine a once-thriving city, its markets full of grain and spices, its streets crowded with merchants, soldiers, and priests. High stone walls rise proudly around it, symbols of security and strength. Inside those walls, families gather by the hearth, nobles boast of their wealth, and commanders trust that their fortifications will hold against any foe. Yet beyond those walls, an army gathers, an enemy patient enough to starve the city into silence. This is the setting of one of the most brutal sieges in history, a siege so merciless that hunger itself became a weapon more powerful than swords. It was not the clash of steel but the growl of empty stomachs that would break the defenders. By the time the walls finally fell, the city would be remembered not for its resilience, but for the horror of what its people were driven to do in order to survive. Cannibalism, unthinkable, unbearable, would become their final act of desperation. But how did it come to this? To answer that question, we must first step back and look at the world beyond the walls. Siege warfare did not erupt without cause. It was the outcome of politics, ambition, and old grudges. The besieging army was not merely hunting territory, it was seeking domination, revenge, or perhaps the final extinguishing of a rival's flame. Every siege in history has a wider context, whether it was the Roman legions encircling Jerusalem in 70 CE, the Crusaders starving out the defenders of Ma'arat al-Numan in 1098, or countless forgotten cities reduced to dust. For the people inside, however, the grand strategies of kings and generals mattered little. What mattered was survival. As the enemy tightened its ring around the city, trade ceased. Supply wagons no longer arrived at the gates. Farmers from the countryside abandoned their fields, seeking shelter inside the walls, only to add more mouths that needed feeding. At first, the tension was invisible. Bakers still had flour, but only enough to bake half as much bread. Soldiers still received rations, but the cuts of meat grew thinner. Children were told to eat slowly, to make the food last. It was the beginning of a slow descent into famine. The besieging army knew exactly what it was doing. Ancient and medieval commanders understood that hunger could accomplish what battering rams could not. Why risk the lives of soldiers in a bloody assault when the defenders could be weakened from within? So, they settled in for the long game. Encampments sprang up around the city, trenches were dug, and watchfires burned through the night. The besiegers were patient, confident that every passing day brought their victory closer. Inside the city, however, patience became despair. Each morning began with the same prayer: perhaps today, allies would march to break the siege. Perhaps reinforcements would arrive. But as the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, hope dimmed. The only news that reached them was grim: no armies were coming, no relief was near. They were alone, locked inside their proud walls, which now became their prison. The rulers and generals tried to project strength. Public proclamations promised victory, claiming that the gods, or destiny, or sheer resilience would see them through. Yet behind closed doors, they argued bitterly. Should they attempt to break out, risking annihilation in open battle? Or should they cling to the walls, trusting that hunger would sap the enemy's will before it broke their own? Every decision carried life-or-death consequences, not only for soldiers but for the thousands of civilians who had no say in the matter. The city itself bore the signs of siege. The once busy streets grew eerily quiet. Markets that had bustled with the noise of haggling merchants now echoed with the cries of the hungry. The fountains still flowed, but clean water could not fill empty bellies. At night, the silence was broken only by the distant horns of the besieging army or the wails of mothers soothing starving children. A sense of dread. If war is often remembered for the clash of armies, the thunder of cavalry, and the brilliance of battlefield maneuvers, then sieges remind us that patience can be just as deadly as steel. Siege warfare was not about swift victories, it was about the slow, methodical destruction of a community's ability to endure. In many ways, the real battle was invisible, fought not with swords and arrows, but with grain sacks and water jars. The besieging commanders knew this well. Their first task was not to storm the walls but to cut the city off from the world. Scouts and cavalry patrolled the countryside, ensuring that no food could be smuggled in. Villages that might supply the city were burned. Wells were poisoned. Any peasants caught trying to sneak food through the lines were executed as examples. By sealing the gates from without, they ensured that the defenders were trapped with only what they already had. Meanwhile, siege engines were constructed, not only to threaten the walls but to remind those inside that time was against them. Massive towers loomed on the horizon, catapults were tested within sight of the defenders, and flaming arrows were sometimes loosed simply to torment. Yet these weapons were often symbolic during the early stages. The true weapon was hunger. The besiegers understood a grim truth: starvation can break morale more thoroughly than any breach in the walls. Inside the city, rationing began as an act of discipline and control. Soldiers received priority, followed by officials and nobles, leaving common families with the scraps. Bakers stretched flour with sawdust or crushed acorns. Soups grew thin, flavored with whatever herbs could be scavenged. At first, the people believed they could hold out. They told themselves that reserves would last, that help would come, that their walls were strong enough. But siege warfare preyed upon time itself. As the weeks dragged on, the strain became unbearable. Each passing day eroded the illusion of safety. The wealthy, who had hidden stores of food, suddenly became targets of envy and resentment. Grain prices soared, and coins lost their meaning when bread was worth more than silver. Those who once laughed together in the markets now eyed one another with suspicion, wondering who had a hidden loaf, who was hoarding, who might be bribed. Hunger also gnawed at discipline. Soldiers grew restless. Guard duty was harder when one's stomach ached. Fights broke out over rations. Desertion became a whispered temptation, though where could one run when the enemy surrounded the walls? The besiegers knew this too and sometimes used psychological warfare, shouting offers of mercy to deserters, or taunting the defenders with displays of captured food. There are accounts of armies roasting animals just within sight of starving citizens, letting the smell carry over the walls as a cruel reminder of abundance denied. The psychological effects were as devastating as the physical ones. Children cried through the night. Parents told stories to distract them from their hunger. Families boiled leather, grass, or weeds, trying to convince themselves they were still eating. The city's priests or holy men urged endurance, claiming the gods would reward their suffering. But for every voice of faith, another whispered despair. Hunger has a way of stripping away illusions. Outside, the besieging army watched with cold calculation. They knew that with every week, their enemy weakened. Disease would creep in soon, carried by filth and overcrowding. Morale would shatter before the walls ever did. And when the gates finally opened, it would not be from victory but from surrender, or from corpses too weak to resist. Siege warfare, in its cruelest form, was a waiting game. It was a contest of endurance, not of courage. For those trapped inside the walls, every sunrise meant one less meal, one more step toward despair. The besiegers did not need to storm the city, they only had to outlast it. And soon, the people inside would discover the darkest truth of all: when hunger has consumed everything else, it begins to consume humanity itself. For weeks, perhaps months, the city had held out. The walls remained standing, the gates unbroken, but inside, something far more terrifying had begun to take hold. Hunger had transformed from a gnawing discomfort into a relentless, unbearable force. Families scavenged for anything edible, scraps of leather, roots, even insects, but it was never enough. Food disappeared faster than it could be found, and the human body, weakened by starvation, became a fragile shadow of itself. As days dragged into weeks with no relief, the psychological strain became acute. Panic spread like wildfire. Mothers wept over empty bowls. Fathers cursed the heavens. Soldiers, once disciplined and proud, found their strength fading. Every morning, eyes searched for even the smallest morsel. Every evening, the stomach screamed louder than swords ever could. Chronic hunger warped minds as much as bodies, making trust a fragile, rare commodity. People began to whisper of desperate acts they had sworn never to commit. Historical accounts from some sieges reveal a grim, harrowing reality: cannibalism. Though horrifying to modern sensibilities, in the heart of a starving city, it became a survival mechanism. Initially, these acts were secretive, shameful, and whispered only among close family or desperate groups. Records from chroniclers, often hesitant to write the details explicitly, hint at parents driven to feed starving children, neighbors driven to betray neighbors, and communities pushed to the brink of unimaginable moral collapse. Yet it was not only survival that fueled the horror. Desperation twisted the social order. Law and tradition weakened. The rich, who had once controlled access to food, found their influence challenged. The powerless, slaves, women, and children, sometimes seized opportunities out of sheer survival instinct. Violence became as common inside the city as it was outside. The streets that had once thrummed with life now echoed with fear, suspicion, and the distant cries of the suffering. Despite this descent into chaos, life still clung stubbornly to the walls. Communities tried to maintain rituals, prayers, and even minimal forms of governance. Some religious leaders exhorted people to patience, claiming divine favor would protect them. Others abandoned hope entirely, retreating into the shadows or succumbing to madness. It was a city divided between endurance and collapse, between humanity and something far darker. From the perspective of the besieging army, this was both inevitable and, in a grim sense, merciful. The attackers understood that patience, not force, was the deadliest tool at their disposal. Every day that the city weakened was another day closer to surrender, another day fewer lives would be lost in a violent storming of the walls. And yet, even from outside, one could see the humanity of the defenders fading, faces hollowed, bodies frail, and eyes haunted by the unthinkable acts they were driven to commit. This section of the siege marks the emotional nadir of the story. It is here that the audience witnesses the raw power of starvation, the collapse of social norms, and the ultimate moral dilemma faced by humans in extremis. The horror is not gratuitous. It is a testimony to the lengths to which survival instincts will stretch, and a reminder that in war, suffering can often outlast the clash of armies, outlast the fire of siege engines, and leave scars far deeper than any battlefield wound. After weeks of relentless starvation and fear, the siege reached its pivotal moment. The defenders, hollowed by hunger and terror, faced a grim reality. The walls that had once symbolized safety could no longer guarantee life. The besiegers, who had patiently waited for this precise moment, began their final moves with calculated precision. Siege engines rolled forward, massive towers bristling with archers creaking under their own weight, battering rams poised to crash against the gates. Flaming arrows streaked across the sky, turning the horizon into a night of fire and smoke. Inside the city, desperation fueled a last burst of resistance. Soldiers, weakened but determined, manned the walls, preparing for the inevitable clash. Civilians, exhausted and terrified, were pressed into service, hauling stones, pouring boiling oil, and setting traps along the battlements. Every heartbeat carried the weight of mortality, every clash of metal against stone sounded like a death knell. Families huddled together, praying for divine intervention, while commanders shouted orders, their voices hoarse yet resolute. The battle itself was a harrowing dance of strategy and chaos. The attackers knew the defenders were starving, they exploited every weakness. Feigned retreats lured men to the walls only to meet ambushes. Siege towers crept closer under cover of darkness, ready to unleash arrows and fire upon the city gates at dawn. Inside, defenders fought bravely, but every swing of a sword was slower, every step heavier. Strength had become a precious commodity, and yet courage persisted, spurred by the instinct to protect home and kin. Historical accounts of similar sieges show the brutality of such confrontations. Walls pounded by battering rams shook with every blow. Gates splintered under repeated assault. Arrows, rocks, and fire rained down simultaneously on both sides. Defenders launched counterattacks from the ramparts, hurling molten metal and stones, trying to repel the onslaught. For a time, it seemed as though endurance alone might still hold them. But the human body has limits, and hunger had already eroded the defenders' stamina. Amidst the violence, the emotional drama intensified. Fathers fought side by side with sons, noble commanders rallied common soldiers, and even children, though terrified, contributed in small ways to the defense. Yet despair lingered in the shadows, families torn apart, neighbors turned against neighbors, and the knowledge that even the most valiant efforts might be in vain. In many ways, this battle was as much internal as external, a struggle between hope and inevitability, courage and exhaustion. Then came the final breach. Whether by cunning, luck, or overwhelming force, the attackers found the weak point in the defenses. Walls crumbled, gates splintered, and chaos spilled into the streets. The defenders fought valiantly, but their strength was spent. Those who had survived famine now faced a new terror, the merciless fury of the victorious army. Combat descended into a brutal melee, where desperation and rage combined into a frenzied storm. Victory for the attackers was swift, but the cost, for both sides, was staggering. This decisive confrontation represents the climactic apex of the siege. It is where strategy meets human endurance, where calculated patience explodes into violent resolution. The audience witnesses both the glory and the horror of warfare, tactical brilliance interwoven with profound tragedy, courage interlaced with suffering, and the ultimate reminder that in history, victory is rarely pure, and defeat is rarely absolute. By the end of this section, the siege has reached its turning point. The walls no longer protect, the defenders are broken, and the story moves inevitably toward the fallout and consequences, a grim aftermath that will leave survivors forever changed. The walls had fallen, the gates were splintered, and the streets that once teemed with life were now littered with the remnants of a shattered city. Victory, if it could be called that, had arrived in the form of desolation. The besieging army stood triumphant, yet even they could not ignore the staggering cost of what they had wrought. Corpses, both of defenders and those who had succumbed to starvation, clogged the streets. Fires smoldered among ruined buildings, sending black smoke into a sky heavy with the scent of death. For the survivors, the horror was only beginning. Families who had clung together through famine now faced loss beyond comprehension. Parents had been lost to illness or combat, children were orphaned, and those who remained were haunted by what they had witnessed, and in some cases, participated in. Cannibalism, once whispered about in fear and shame, had left permanent scars on the collective psyche. Trust among neighbors had been shattered, and the social fabric of the city lay in tatters. Every alleyway and courtyard bore testimony to human suffering. The conquering army enforced its authority with uncompromising rigor. Those who had survived the wall's collapse were often enslaved, ransomed, or executed, ensuring that the city could not rise again to challenge their power. Looting, pillaging, and destruction became part of the grim ritual of victory. Temples were desecrated, homes burned, and storerooms emptied. The goal of domination had been achieved, but it was a hollow triumph. For both the victors and the vanquished, the cost was measured not only in lives but in humanity itself. Yet, the aftermath extended beyond immediate suffering. The fall of a city reverberated across the surrounding lands. Refugees fled to neighboring towns, spreading disease, fear, and instability. Trade networks collapsed, leaving regions dependent on the generosity or cruelty of others. And while the siege had concluded, its legacy endured. Chroniclers and historians would record its horrors, passing down stories of desperation, starvation, and the extremes of human endurance. The memory of such suffering would shape future generations' understanding of war, morality, and survival. Emotionally, this period is as gripping as the siege itself. The audience is confronted not with the thrill of battle, but with the weight of consequences, the emotional, social, and moral aftermath. Children who survived the siege might never smile again. Commanders who orchestrated attacks must wrestle with the knowledge that victory came at a human cost far greater than anticipated. Even those who were spared death carry scars that time cannot heal. This section highlights the contrast framing between ambition and downfall. The conquerors achieved their goal, yet what they gained is meaningless when measured against the suffering that victory demanded. Meanwhile, the defenders, though defeated, leave behind a testament to resilience, endurance, and the human spirit's stubborn fight against impossible odds. It is a haunting reminder that history is not only written in battles won or lost but in the lives irrevocably altered by them. The city lies in ruins, the screams of hunger and terror replaced by silence and memory. From here, the story will shift toward reflection, looking at the long-lasting echoes of this siege across history and what lessons it leaves for the generations that follow. Long after the fires had died and the walls had crumbled, the siege continued to haunt history. Its scars were not just physical but psychological, etched into the memory of survivors, chroniclers, and even generations yet to come. Cities rise and fall, armies march and dissolve, but the story of a people pushed beyond the brink of humanity remains enduring, a warning etched in time. This siege was remembered not for the strength of its walls or the cunning of its generals, but for the human suffering it unleashed and the moral lines it forced people to cross. Across centuries, historians have drawn parallels to other infamous sieges, where famine, fear, and desperation reshaped society. From Carthage to Leningrad, from Jerusalem to Ma'arat al-Numan, the pattern repeats. When supplies vanish, when hope fades, people are driven to the edge. And in that edge, the question becomes not how to fight, but how to survive. Military historians study these moments not only for tactics but for insight into the limits of human endurance. Anthropologists and sociologists look deeper, analyzing how communities maintain, or lose, their moral compass under unimaginable pressure. The siege also influenced literature, art, and collective memory. Chroniclers of the era painted vivid scenes of horror and heroism, ensuring that the story would survive far longer than the city itself. Poets wrote of families torn apart, generals recorded strategies that proved effective but morally ambiguous, and priests warned of divine judgment for the extremes of suffering endured. These accounts transformed the siege from a historical event into a cautionary tale, reminding future generations of the duality of war, the glory of conquest and the devastation it leaves behind. Ultimately, the legacy of this siege is both stark and haunting. It is a testament to human resilience, showing how people cling to life even when all seems lost. But it is also a reminder of fragility, how quickly civilization can unravel under pressure, how morality can be tested to its limits, and how hunger and fear can strip away the veneer of humanity. The story does not end with the fall of walls or the retreat of armies. It lives on in memory, echoing across centuries as a sobering reflection on the true cost of war. As the documentary closes, the audience is left with a lingering question. When the pressures of survival mount beyond imagination, what are we capable of? And what does it take to preserve not just life, but the humanity that defines it? In this final reflection, the siege is more than a historical event. It becomes a mirror, showing both the darkest impulses and the enduring spirit of human beings when confronted with unimaginable trials.